Ms. Rose?
Sorry, good afternoon, friends, ladies and gentlemen, of course, to our fellow human rights defenders and advocates. Welcome to our new episode of iDefend live stream. And this afternoon, we'll be talking about a very important institution of the United Nations that is essentially formulating international public legal standards, for the whole world or for all the countries to follow. It is called the International Law Commission. And tomorrow, the ILC will have its election for a new set of members of the ILC who will be formulating these important legal standards for all countries. In August of this year, iDefend, or In Defense of Human Rights and Dignity movement, sent a letter to the UN missions in Geneva and New York to call for the rejection of the nomination of presidential spokesperson 𝗵𝗃𝗏𝗏 to the International Law Commission. This letter was signed by thousands of individuals and hundreds of organizations, and we'll be discussing about that later. Also, the Free Legal Assistance Group, of course, our premier legal group in the Philippines, CSOs who have been with us since the 1970s, also sent their rejection petition to the UN and a supplemental objection, because they think that, as iDefend did, Mr. Attorney 𝗵𝗃𝗏𝗏 is not fit to be a member of the ILC. And just this very recently, another 150 lawyers also sent their letter to object to 𝗵𝗃𝗏𝗏's nomination. At the same time, we also now, in partnership with a friend, a colleague, a network in Sri Lanka called International Truth and Justice Project, who is also calling for the rejection of their own nominee to the ILC, former Attorney General Mohan Peiris. Peiris serves as Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the UN in New York from 2008 to 11, and he served as Attorney General of Sri Lanka. I think this is equivalent to our Consul General, no? Peiris failed to investigate or prosecute those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Sri Lanka. The International Truth and Justice Project documents, collects, and preserves evidence of serious international crimes and ongoing violations in Sri Lanka. Our effort this afternoon is to emphasize that the ILC nomination of officials have the nomination of these officials will enable and condone gross human rights violations in our countries, in the Philippines and Sri Lanka, and it is unacceptable and should be opposed. The opposition to their nominations is being led by groups or CSOs who have experienced the brunt of reprisals and vilifications of both governments, because of our stand for truth, justice, and human rights. So we will be discussing what is the impact of the election of 𝗵𝗃𝗏𝗏 and Peiris to the ILC, and why is accountability important, and how does it contribute to enforcing justice and moving forward? Right. We would like to raise the public awareness about the petition against 𝗃𝗏𝗏 and Peiris, continue to gain support for the campaign for the UN General Assembly to be enlightened and would not vote for 𝗃𝗏𝗏 and Peiris, and of course strengthen our human rights advocacy in the Philippines. And we will discuss again, as I mentioned earlier, some implications if these two persons would be voted to the ILC. Tomorrow we will the UN General Assembly at 11 a.m. New York time, and it will be 11 p.m. Philippine time. There will be I think a secret voting, and eventually we will learn if these two persons will be elected to the ILC. And we hope, of course, not. So this afternoon, we are very fortunate to have a guest, who are legal luminaries in their own ways. No? Of course, we have also a guest who is not a lawyer, but is a lead of in defense of human rights and dignity movement. So may I briefly introduce our guests, and maybe they can say a little about themselves, but the discussion we will be doing later. So may I call from iDefend, Mr. Joseph De Jesus, our national coordinator. Jay, just a short hello or introduction.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, so that's Jay De Jesus. And of course, we all know him, Attorney 𝗿𝗲𝗙𝗃𝗏𝗏. Attorney 𝗿𝗲𝗏. You are in.
You're on mute.
Hi, sorry. Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. I'm 𝗿𝗏𝗏 from the Free Legal Assistance Group.
Salamat po. And of course, Attorney Dino De Leon, who is from the office of Senator Laila De Lima and also representative of our 150 lawyers, who also sent their objection. Attorney Dina.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dino De Leon. I'm the spokesperson of Senator Laila De Lima.
Okay, thank you for being with us. And I think we lost. Okay. Just on cue. Yasmin, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
My name's Yasmin Suker. I'm a human rights lawyer from South Africa. I served on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I was also a member of the Secretary General's expert panel investigating war crimes and accountability in Sri Lanka. I currently serve as the Executive Director of the International Truth and Justice Project on Sri Lanka, which documents war crimes and ongoing violations in Sri Lanka with a view to promoting accountability. And thank you so much for having me today. Such a pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmin. So we will start, of course, with the background of these petitions. Why did these CSOs, iDefend, FLAG, and the 150 lawyers sent this petition or objected to the nomination of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏? So we will be speaking first on the Philippines, on the Philippine nominee, and then later on the Sri Lankan nominee. May I start, please, with Jay De Jesus, iDefend. Jay.
Thank you, Ms. Rose. I hope I can be heard clearly.
Yes.
For iDefend, I will just be reading some of the points raised. So a few years back, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 co-founded a broad human rights organization. He even volunteered his students to help in the plight of Hanjin shipyard workers who were continuously violated in their workplace. He was very vocal on the issue of the West Philippine Sea. He and with other lawyers defended and won the case of Jennifer Laude, a transgender woman murdered by a U.S. Marine in 2015. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 was a very active figure in campaigning for the Philippines to join the International Criminal Court. But when the Duterte administration took office, he has turned 180 degrees from everything he was fighting for. He became a mouthpiece for this murderous and criminal regime. He has defended all the misogynist attacks of the president. He has defended all the atrocities and negligence of the Duterte regime, especially during this pandemic, and even putting the blame on the victims and the people. Roque even misinformed our people about the gravity of the crimes happening under the war on drugs and undermined the importance of international mechanisms for the protection of human rights, especially the International Criminal Court. Our petition, the iDEFEND petition, asserts that Mr. Roque seeks to shield the country's president accused of crimes against humanity before the International Criminal Court from any liability, while at the same time undermining the importance of the court's inquiry to the human rights situation in the Philippines. His opinions betray a conduct ill-befitting of a state agent, much less a member of the legal profession. Mr. Roque actively promoted that the government will not cooperate with the ICC investigation. He sought to discredit the victims by red tagging them and branding them as enemies of the state. Worst, he has become an apologist for the president's crass and insulting behavior towards women and the LGBT community. We believe that the position to the ILC requires genuine knowledge and commitment to justice and accountability, and the Philippine nominee must have unquestionable integrity. As an increasing number of groups mount their protests, we ask that the government withdraw his nomination immediately. As the voting happens tomorrow, we continuously appeal to the member states voting for a representative from the Asia Pacific region to reject Harry Roque's bid. Having him in the ILC is a disservice to international justice, an embarrassment to our people, and a disappointment to all the victims of human rights violations here in the Philippines, whom he has mocked, vilified, and continued to attack. We are also appealing to the people to join us in this call and fight for accountability of this present regime. Within a few months, we are going to elect a new government. And if we are able to elect into office a government that respects human rights, prioritizes human dignity, and rights-based approach to governance, pursuing respectful relations with the international community, then rest assured that it will be a government without a Harry Roque.
Great. Thank you, Jay. I think I made a mistake, no? We're supposed to have at least an initial discussion on the ILC and its background, and we actually requested Yasmin to do that for us. So before I call on Attorney Te, may I call on Yasmin to give us a brief background on what ILC is, and why is it important, and why are we really doing this rejection? Yasmin?
Thank you, Rose. So, let me start off by saying that after the Second World War, many states believed, and many legal experts, that it was really important to establish a body that would begin to codify what international law was all about. It would also begin to look at the question of what the responsibilities of states are in terms of both treaty obligations and also customary international law. And so in December 1946, the General Assembly passed Resolution 94, which called upon the Committee of Legal Experts to make recommendations to the Secretary General on the ways in which the General Assembly could promote the progressive development of international law, including its codification. And finally, in 1947, the International Law Commission was formed pursuant to the Charter of the United Nations. And its mandate was specifically to develop and systematize international law. It has its first session in 1949, but when you look at the list of issues on its agenda, it touches so many of the issues which Jay actually raised now in his presentation. The first thing that the committee had to look at was how it would deal with concerns in the world around international crimes, such as genocide and acts of aggression. It also was required to look at the Nuremberg principles and the definition of crimes against peace of mankind. And it had to look at how to establish a judicial body to prosecute those leaders guilty of genocide. But in addition to that, it had to find ways of making rules that were across the world in civil, civil countries and in common law countries. It would bring all of that together. But as you can see, the clear line from 1949 was really around this question of accountability for serious international crimes. So the committee itself is made up of 34 experts, and they are responsible for helping to develop and codify international law. And the 34 individuals, while nominated by states, they are elected really on the basis of their expertise and their qualifications in international law. And in fact, they hold that post for a period of 5 years. Now, the ILC holds annual sessions at the UN office in Geneva to discuss the topics that they're dealing with. And this year in September, they reviewed really important issues. The first was the question of the immunity of state officials from foreign criminal jurisdictions. And you can imagine for human rights lawyers, this is a really critical issue for all of us, because when you can't hold them accountable in your own country, what you try and do is make sure you can do that in another country. It also looked at another important issue, which is applicable to both the Philippines and Sri Lanka and many other countries: the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, the protection of the atmosphere, the peremptory norms of general international law, and then, of course, the succession of states in respect of state responsibility. And this is increasingly becoming a problem where, new successor states don't want to acknowledge the treaties and conventions that have been signed onto by former regimes. And so this was an important question raised. And then another topic was the rise of sea levels in relation to international law. And I think this affects all of these countries who have boundaries really with the sea, and how that affects the general application of climate justice. Now, the committee, when you look at it and you look at the topic we're discussing, you can see why they need country experts who have impeccable legal credentials in the field of international law. Because what are we covering? We're covering human rights law, we're covering international humanitarian law, we're covering international criminal law, and we're also looking at the question of Jus Cogens law. And so people who are put on this committee, they don't represent their states, they actually represent all of us in the world. And so what we need are people of absolutely, integrity. I'll stop there, but I think you can see from the kind of work that the ILC does why you need, nominations from member states who themselves are aware of their human rights records, but secondly, people who have integrity and who are impeccable in their own practice of law. Thank you, Rose, for that opportunity.
Thank you, Yasmin. And it actually enlightened me, we were talking about ILC and the representation of the nominee by our country, But when you said that it actually represents, this nominee will actually represent me and every one of us, Because what they are discussing are very critical to our survivor, to our human rights, to our humanity, and of course the future of our planet, including environment. And I think that is really very important. And of course, with the Philippines, and I think also Sri Lanka, we have issues with the ICC, and ILC are also codifying concerns on international war crimes, or even perhaps yung issues of crime against humanity. So I think that is very short but very concise description of ILC, and we hope that our audience really now understand the very importance of the ILC. So may I now call on Attorney Ted to discuss about flag petition against the nomination of Attorney Harry Roque. Attorney Ted.
Yes, thank you, Rose. We actually submitted an objection on the 12th of September of 2021, and we supplemented that with another objection on September 29, 2021. If you will allow me, I'll read portions of our two submissions. We, the Free Legal Assistance Group, objected to the nomination to the ILC of Mr. Roque because we believe that he does not possess the qualifications for a seat in the commission. He has the basic law degree. He has taught international law, but his documented public pronouncements as spokesperson of the current Philippine president clearly show that he is ill-befitted, ill-suited to become a member of the commission. The commission is reserved, membership in the commission is reserved to persons of recognized competence in both doctrinal and practical aspects of international law. He is on record as having publicly defended extrajudicial killings. He has belittled the competence and jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. He has shown a cavalier disregard of the effects of domestic violence, of human rights, among others, based on his own words. And these public pronouncements make him ill-suited for the work of the commission. His pronouncements have been made alternately with sneering contempt for the plight of victims or a callous attempt to justify the same with misplaced humor. He has used his knowledge of international law to undermine the protections that international law provides under a regime of human rights and the rule of law. And so all of these, including his specific pronouncements, and may I just cite a few, on the UN Human Rights Commission. In July 2019, after the United Nations Human Rights Council, UNHRC had called for a comprehensive report on extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, Mr. Roque responded by calling the UNHRC a, quote, toothless tiger, unquote, and a mere, quote, shaming machinery, unquote, among other descriptions. He went on to emphasize his view that the UNHRC lacks the moral authority to enforce human rights. Quote, it's that last item on the list that is of particular importance because being a shaming mechanism requires having the moral authority to call for the enforcement of fundamental human rights. To be clear, I am saying that the UNHRC does not have that moral authority, unquote. Mr. Roque has publicly belittled the United Nations and its efforts to protect human rights under international law. He must be the last person to deserve a seat in the International Law Commission. He has also issued public pronouncements on ICC jurisdiction on complementarity, which have been confusing to the people. And given his law degree and given his previous experience as a teacher of public international law, it cannot be said that he is unaware that his statements are wrong. Mr. Roque claimed, for example, that under the principle of complementarity, the ICC will not exercise jurisdiction unless a member state is unable or unwilling to prosecute. He claimed that there is no unwillingness to prosecute in the Philippines, as shown by the imprisonment of two previous Philippine presidents after the respective terms. Of course, the element of, quote, unwillingness, unquote, refers to the unwillingness to prosecute the same person against whom the proceedings before the ICC is conducted, namely his principal, and for the same conduct alleged in the proceedings. This is shown in cases decided by the ICC. And so by justifying the absence of unwillingness based on a misleading citation of cases involving other persons, Mr. Roque has demonstrated that he is patently unaware of the ICC decisions or that he applies international law in a deliberately misleading manner. Whichever way we read it, he is certainly not deserving of a seat on the ILC. He also has, of course, issued public pronouncements that have misled and confused people on the effect of the withdrawal of the Philippines from the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. It is clear to everyone that withdrawal from the Rome Statute does not divest the ICC of jurisdiction to investigate crimes that occurred until the date when the withdrawal took effect. But Mr. Roque has claimed that the ICC cannot do that. Of course, the action of the prosecutor has proven him wrong. So our objection is really based on his lack of credentials, lack of qualification to sit in such an important commission, such an important body, which will determine in every possible way where international law will go. And as has already been mentioned, he does not represent just one country. He represents humanity, and therefore the person who sits on the ILC must be a person of absolute integrity. He must be a person who is beyond partisan considerations. He must be a person who is recognized as among the top, the most competent, the most credible. And on all of these criteria, we believe that based on his own public pronouncements, Mr. Roque does not fit the bill. And therefore, FLAG has written to the ILC and to the representatives of the member states that Mr. Roque should not sit on the ILC. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Ted. I know that, of course, you have known Attorney Harry Roque for a long time, no? But why would our government nominate him? If there is that question, no? Is there anything to gain for the administration if he sits with the
I am sorry, Rose. I don't think I am in a position to speak for this government or even to speculate on what this government thinks. So I'm sorry. I have to beg that I cannot answer that question. It's not possible for me to consider what this government is thinking.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, but I'm sure Jay would be talking. I can discuss that later. Of course, within the perspective of us human rights defender, we know that the administration has something to gain, no? If Harry Roque sits in the ILC, and it would be very regrettable for all of us. And aside from FLAG, no, which has been with us since 1972, no, since the start, 74, I think. Sorry po. Since the martial law days, no, I am with the Medical Action Group before, and we've been visiting jails with FLAG. And very proud to be, of course, to have known FLAG for all these years. But there is another group, no, of 150 lawyers. It was not a their letter to objection might be late, no, but the essence, no, of the objection is really, of course, very important, and also strengthened, no, the positions of iDefend and FLAG and all others who objected to the nomination of Attorney Harry Roque. So, Attorney Dino, can you also discuss with us the objection of these 150 lawyers?
Okay, thank you, Rose. If you would allow me, I'll just first read the statement. I'm also a signatory, and I represent those 150 plus lawyers who signed this as of yesterday, but there's still a lot of people who are signing. So let me start. We, members of the Philippine Bar, in our individual and or organizational capacities, respectfully put on record our vehement objection to the candidacy of Filipino lawyer Herminio Harry Roque Jr. to the UN International Law Commission. Attorney Roque is the official spokesperson of President Rodrigo Duterte, who is now facing investigation by the International Criminal Court for alleged crimes against humanity for the extrajudicial killings and other violations in the so-called drug war. Unfortunately, Harry has unbelievably defended and justified President Duterte's pronouncements enabling extrajudicial killings, attacks on the rule of law and due process, and on his unacceptable positions on human rights, justice, pandemic responses, and good governance. Quite incongruous for a professed international law expert, he has openly undermined international mechanisms on accountability like the ICC, the UN Human Rights Council, and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Harry has also publicly enfeebled platforms for resolutions of conflicts like the Permanent Court of Arbitration. As a lawyer, he is supposed to be a purveyor of facts and the truth and should uphold the administration of justice, a role he has sacrificed in exchange for his blind loyalty to a strongman president. We fear he will bring this with him to the ILC. Lamentably, Harry has rationalized extrajudicial killings and tolerated the weaponization of the law against activists, dissenters, and the opposition. He is very sensitive to legitimate criticism and even berated media and health professionals, calling out government on its policies and practices. As fellow lawyers, we are scandalized by his spins and reinvention of basic legal principles and concepts in his zealousness to repackage the President Duterte's pronouncements of questionable legal and constitutional basis. Even more appalling for us is that Mr. Roque has baselessly ascribed less than noble motives and even publicly red tagged or labeled anyone who opposes nomination and candidacy to the ILC. For these reasons alone, we regret as his brethren to express our considered view that to allow his undeserved election to the ILC would be an aberration to its mandate, might diminish its standing before the international community of nations, and even affect its credibility as a body that it will initiate studies and make recommendations to encourage the progressive development and codification of international law. Hence, we are compelled to ask your permanent mission to decline giving our very own colleague in the legal profession, Mr. Roque, your crucial vote in his candidacy to be a member of the ILC. There have been 152 signatories as of 8 November 2021, 3:15 p.m. Philippine time. I just want to say also, Rose, as the spokesperson of Senator Layla de Lima, that there are three basic reasons why presidential spokesperson Harry Roque should not be a member of the ILC. Number one, the other people and even the statements have already mentioned that his track record is not very good. He cannot. The members of the ILC should be respected members of the legal profession, and presidential spokesperson Harry Roque cannot be said to be a respected member of the legal profession or that of his peers, apart from being the prime defender and sanitizer of the foremost human rights violator in the Philippines, or the enabler of persecution and opposition and the weaponization of the law in the Philippines. Aside from the fact that he has weakened domestic institutions such as the Commission on Human Rights, the COA, and the Senate, and apart from the fact that he also expressed disdain for international institutions such as the United Nations, the ICC, or even the International Tribunal, the Law of the Seas, Mr. Harry Roque was a persecutor himself when he was a representative in the House of Representatives, representing a party list of Senator Layla de Lima. He led the character assassination of Senator Layla de Lima, and somebody of his caliber does not deserve to be in the ILC. His competence is also quite questionable because we are uncertain if it's lack of integrity or the fact that he does not know his basic legal principles, because he has been publicly declaring amazing statements insofar as international law is concerned. Finally, we have to take a look at posterity, and we have to send a message that the likes of Harry Roque cannot be rewarded with a position in the ILC, especially considering the fact that the entirety of his track record speaks for itself. We cannot just be selective on the past things that he may have contributed to the legal profession. We have to take a look at the entirety of his track record, and if we are going to take a look at his track record holistically and weigh everything that he has done for the legal profession, it will be very, very clear that he has attacked institutions, both international and local, and he cannot be allowed to be a member of the ILC if we want to send the right message across generations.
Salamat po. And I am reminded, when you say that we cannot just look at his contributions kahit papano, in the past on human rights and IHL, we have to look at it comprehensively. And I remember Harry Roque was really very active when we were lobbying for the Rome Statute, the ICC. And once he became the chairperson or the lead of the Philippine coalition on the ICC. Now, eventually, when he became spokesperson and started justifying all these extrajudicial killings and compromising the understanding to the ICC, the coalition actually removed him as member of the PCICC because we think he is not walking his talk, no, pushing for the Rome Statute, and then being okay with our withdrawal to the ICC and justifying this this genocide or the war crimes, no, committed by this administration. And also, may I just inform everyone that the iDefend petition actually garnered 315 organizations as signatories, 29,011 individuals, no, as signatories from 99 countries. And these are not only Filipinos, no, but even international friends who understand this objection is really very critical to preserve human rights and humanity. So this is the Philippines. No? This is our objection against Attorney 𝗏𝗏𝗏, the spokesperson of the president. Okay. Now let us hear what does our colleague in Sri Lanka, represented of course by our human rights defender in South Africa, can say about their own nominee. Why are they objecting to Mohan Paris? Yasmin, it's your turn.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you to your colleagues. As I was speaking, I was also thinking about the role that has been played by the International Law Commission. And, you know, what many people probably don't know is that they developed the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is really the framework for interpreting and forming treaties and conventions. And then they were also tasked with developing the statute for the international criminal law, which is really the first international court, which binds those states who ratify the treaty, and really looking at accountability for the three most serious crimes: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So besides the question of the codification of international law, you can look at the origins of this. But I think that, you know, what it does raise for me, and, you know, it's something that I'm still grappling with, is whether states who at a particular time do not uphold their own responsibilities should be allowed to nominate representatives to this kind of august body, or should there be some kind of assessment around, do civil society organizations agree with the state's nomination when that state itself is in violation of its own obligations? And so when one looks at Sri Lanka, I would argue that the Commission should refuse to accept a nomination from Sri Lanka because it has reneged on its own domestic and international law obligations to deal with accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated at the end of the war in 2009, as well as, of course, the ongoing violations. You know, in May 2009, the government was victorious in defeating the Tamil Tigers, but in the process of doing so, they perpetrated serious international crimes, which led really to two inquiries, one on which I sat on advising the Secretary General, and the second, which was much more comprehensive, conducted by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, where it found that, in fact, the status and levels of what had been perpetrated amounted to crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, this included the alleged killing of thousands of civilians, the attacks on hospitals, question of starvation, the question of enforced disappearances, and summary judicial executions, which have not been investigated by the country itself. But nevertheless, when there was a change in regime in 2015, the new government committed under a joint resolution with the Human Rights Council to promote accountability through a transitional justice program. And that included establishing a hybrid or special court, a truth commission, an office of missing persons, and of course, dealing with the question of reparations. But shockingly, when the Rajapaksa's returned to power, they immediately broke ties and reneged on the resolution. And so this year in March, following a deeply disturbing report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council approved a resolution to establish an investigative mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so really, I think a question we have to raise is, when we appoint someone from a state which is not compliant with its own domestic and international obligations, doesn't it make a mockery of such an esteemed body? And would it not reward Sri Lanka, which in itself would be a problem? But then I would like to come to the person they have nominated, namely Mr. Mohan Perez, who is currently Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations. But of course, it's his past record, which many international human rights bodies have pronounced on, which really raises questions. Mohan Perez was the Attorney General during this pivotal period of the final phase of the war between 2008 and 2011. He was the chief legal advisor to the president and to all departments and ministries of government, including the state security forces and the police. And of course, in that capacity, he had the power and responsibility to direct and advise police investigations, and also to properly prepare cases for indictment and prosecution. And as Attorney General, it was expected that he would independently and credibly investigate the multiple allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity that were reported at the time. And of course, as I said, this included attacks on civilian objects, the denial of food and medicine to the civilian population, enforced disappearances, summary executions, rape and sexual violence by state forces. And he didn't do so. Now, in fact, in the period, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the government set up a rehabilitation program for former combatants. But at the time, the International Commission of Jurists criticized Mohan Perez for failing to address serious legal shortcomings in the government's rehabilitation program for thousands of ex-combatants. And in fact, the ICJ, and I quote, talked about this program operating in a legal vacuum. And they said that this was possibly the largest mass administrative detention anywhere in the world. They also talked about the fact that Perez had been responsible for drafting the policy framework on rehabilitation, and they raised a number of serious human rights concerns about the mandatory and involuntary nature of rehabilitation. And I quote, they said, which involved the deprivation of liberty of the rehabilitee, and which the ICJ said would amount to individual and collective punishment without criminal conviction, the denial of the right to challenge the detention and rehabilitation, and the duration of up to 2 years detention without charge or trial or access to lawyers. These were serious human rights concerns. And in fact, the ICJ in September 2010 warned of the legal problems with a program which at that time had detained at least 8,000 people. And in fact, the ICJ described this as detainees who were in a legal black hole. And they made the point that the camps were administered by the Sri Lankan army, that he had in fact been directly engaged in active combat against the people they were now detaining without any kind of check and balance. And numerous UN bodies have in fact found that torture and sexual torture was ripe in rehabilitation. But let me come to some of the other pronouncements he's made. You know, Perez is also reported to have been untruthful in his submissions to the Committee Against Torture when in November 2011, he led the Sri Lankan delegation to appear before the committee. And many people found that he was completely in denial and he was evasive around the secret detention facilities and enforced disappearances, as well as the fact that the courts were in fact accepting confessions taken under detention as evidence. But it was really his response in relation to a question from the committee on an emblematic case involving the enforced disappearance of a prominent journalist, 𝗶𝗗𝗙𝗃𝗃𝗍𝗔𝗍, that really raises his suitability to be appointed to the ILC. The government, when they made their formal written submission in response to questions, they said that they were in fact investigating the disappearance. But when Mohan Perez was questioned by the committee, he was alleged to have said that the disappearance was a hoax and that in fact the journalist who was enforced disappeared had in fact taken refuge in a foreign country. And it led the journalist's wife Sandhya to rebut this and in fact to say that if her husband was alive, he would have contacted her. And she challenged Mr. Perez to say where her husband was hiding. And journalists in Sri Lanka were so outraged that they wrote to the UNCAT committee and they said, and I quote, "I believe that the statement made by Mr. Perez to your committee is an irresponsible and a mala fide act, as he has not presented any of this information to us and to the Sri Lankan courts, and he hid those facts from us." In a case of another detainee, a journalist, Tisanayagam, who had been detained for 5 months and psychologically tortured when a confession was extracted under torture, which led to him being sentenced for 20 years in prison. Perez is alleged to have been instrumental in denying Tissa bail and was said to be responsible for drawing up the indictment based on his confession obtained under duress. But of course, before UNCAT, Perez also defended the government's conduct during the war, so much so that one of the foreign ministers of Sri Lanka actually said in a statement that Perez had lied before the committee. So given the critique of Mohan Perez by Sri Lankan ministers, by Sri Lankan civil society, by the International Committee of Jurists, by UNCAT and journalists, in my view, the International Law Commission will need to consider whether he is a fit and proper person to be appointed to such an illustrious body. Does he have, firstly, the legal expertise and the qualifications which are necessary to serve? But more importantly, does he have an active human rights record in promoting not just the human rights of Sri Lankan citizens, but would he stand up for all of our human rights? Because that's what he would be called upon to do. And so these questions of integrity and expertise and independence are questions which the ILC will need to take into account. And of course, I would say to you and to everybody else, you be the judge of whether he's a fit and proper person to sit on this committee. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
I really cannot say which one is the worst, no? But both of us, Sri Lanka and the Philippines, have this stake at the international bodies, the Human Rights Council's decision on war crimes in Sri Lanka, and of course our ICC case now against the perpetrators of the war on drugs. And I think these are very important issues, and this is the crux of our objection against this particular people, 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗏 and 𝗃𝗏𝗃. But Attorney Ted, they will be leaving us very soon, so maybe we can pose some questions to our lawyers, no, who are, of course, the experts on international field and domestic legal concerns. May we ask, what can we expect in the process of the election of the ILC members tomorrow? Would anyone wants to share? Do you think how would be the process? And perhaps additional question, will our protest actions, our campaigns, really have impact, no? Will we be successful in ensuring that these two people are not elected to the ILC? Maybe anyone po can answer, even Yasmin, please, or Ted, Attorney Ted, whoever, Attorney Dino. Two questions on the process, and will our campaign really impact the election tomorrow?
Well, I really cannot claim any knowledge of what goes on internally in terms of the elections. And as to the second question, what would be the impact? Well, of course, we are hopeful that the member states, the representatives of the member states, will consider the objections very seriously. After all, they have the capacity to vote and to put these people in the commission, and so that's possibly the only thing we can do from this part of the world to hope that our objections are sufficient and that they are convincing enough. But as far as the procedure, I really cannot claim personal knowledge of what goes on.
Thank you, Attorney Ted. Attorney Dino, Yasmin, would you want to answer the questions?
Well,
yeah. Yes, go ahead, Yasmin.
No, I was just going to say that, obviously this is usually done by secret ballot. And, there's a lot of horse trading that goes on before these elections. But, when you look at the countries who've made nominations, you realize that everybody's going to try and see how they can secure votes for their nominee. And so that bit of the process is quite opaque and not so transparent. And perhaps that's something we can lobby on in the future, that, these elections should be done in a much more public way so that one can kind of comment. I would argue that certainly for a core group of member states where human rights are really of importance, but also the fitness of applicants, that definitely these petitions and these campaigns would have an impact. But, for countries where it's a pure self-interest of the honor of having your person on the committee, I'm not sure about them. And that's why I think we need in the future to campaign around the question of transparency. But you have run a very effective campaign, and, the signatures are impressive. So it would be hard-pressed for countries not to take notice of that.
Thank you. Attorney Dina?
Well, we can only assume that the countries that will be voting in tomorrow's session will have their own motivations. And I'd like to take a look at this in two lenses. The first lens will most probably be realpolitik. Of course, the countries, other countries may have been influenced, so to speak, by our country in terms of voting for or continue to support the candidacy of 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗏. So that's for realpolitik. However, I would like to think that there is also another motivation, and that is for other countries who will really make a principled stand and a principled vote. So I hope that with respect to your second question, how how did we affect in terms of our campaign? Hopefully, we affected the other countries who will make a principled vote. Of course, for those people or for those countries whose main consideration is not really principles but realpolitik, then maybe it would be difficult to already convince them. But in terms of other countries who are representatives who would want to make a principled vote, I would like to think that our campaign made a dent or at least partly influenced how the voting will turn out tomorrow. But regardless of whether or not we would have made a dent, I think the movement in itself and the petition that we've done, the campaign that we've done, is still a victory, because we sent a message clearly that the likes of 𝗵𝗃 and those people who has atrocious records will not be left unnoticed. And there will be human rights defenders who will actually hold them into account for their atrocious actions.
Thank you. Salamat po. I have another question also related, of course, to the process. But please correct me. I understand that if 𝗵𝗃 or Mohan Perez is elected to the ILC, it's not a regular position. So can they still occupy positions in government while still serving the ILC? Anyone po who knows the answer or can enlighten us? Anyone? Yasmin, would if they are elected in the ILC, can they still hold positions in our government?
I think that if the distinction would probably be around whether or not they serve the executive, because remember I said that the person who is elected basically doesn't represent his or her state, but it is really a position which when you hold a special procedures, you have to look at whether there would be a potential for a conflict of interest. So I would imagine that if he's as close to the president as being the spokesperson, that could possibly be something where he's called upon to really stand down. Now, in the case of Mohan Perez, he occupies the position of being the permanent rep. Basically, he's the ambassador. So it's an honorary kind of position. So I imagine that he could do both. But I think there's an important question around the perceptions of conflict of interest and being so close to a particular executive that it could constrain your ability to act in an independent way. And in fact, if you also look at a number of the people who sit on the committee, you'll see most of them are people who are legal professors, because the kind of questions that they're being asked to develop really require incredible knowledge and expertise of international law. And in fact, more recently, one of my colleagues, from Sierra Leone, he's been sitting on the committee that is also drafting the new convention around a crime against humanity. But he's also proposed a new way of a new topic for the ILC, and that is looking at subsidiary legal interpretation. Given the fact that we've reached so far around codification. So you can kind of see that the combination needs to be people who will be loyal really to the promise of human rights and international law, but also to have the kind of legal expertise and a separation almost from the state that they serve, because you're not seen as representing your state when you sit there. And that's an important thing to look at.
Thank you, Yasmin, for that clarification and enlightenment. Well, in the Philippines, we have another dynamics, no? Of course, the national election. And I remember 𝗵𝗃 said when he was about to go home to the Philippines, no? After his physical campaign at the United Nations, no? He threatened, no, just to get even to us, those who objected to his petition, he would be running, for a seat. I do not know, in the Senate or in Congress or wherever. So, Attorney Ted and Attorney Dino, what do you think would be the impact of that? First, if he is accepted to the ILC, can he still run on in an election? And what would be the impact on that? Is that possible, Attorney Ted?
I don't think there's a prohibition, but I do agree with Yasmin that the overarching consideration really should be conflict of interest and the possibility that the person would be tied down to specific interests. Now, as far as Philippine law is concerned, there is no prohibition against, for example, a member of Congress sitting in the ILC. Now, it's really a question of, well, propriety, which goes to character and integrity. And so I think around this room, we're pretty much united as far as that is concerned, that there is very little to none as far as that is concerned, because otherwise he would have withdrawn his bid. So for me, it really doesn't, it's really not particularly relevant that he runs in the election, because he will have to contend and get votes in the same way as any other person. The concern really is the injury, the damage someone who is unqualified to sit in the ILC can do to international law, and I think that is the more pressing concern. He can run, that is his right. If he wants to run for election, that is his right. He will have to contend with the electorate and stand by his own record. But the concern really is the damage that can be done by an obvious partisan who is there with an agenda and on the formation and progressive development of international law. So yeah.
Thank you po. Attorney Dino, would you like to add something?
Well, I agree that in fact the main consideration has to be conflict of interest, even though there's no prohibition. If we're talking about 𝗟𝗏𝗏 in particular, presidential spokesperson 𝗟𝗏𝗏, whether or not he is an elected official, I think he will have that conflict of interest because of his blind loyalty. And if he threatened, if he threatened to run for senator or for any public position, by all means he can do that. And of course, we will also campaign against that, and we will show him that it wouldn't be easy. I don't think, and this is just my personal honest evaluation, I don't think that such kind of words from Secretary 𝗟𝗏𝗏 will be as threatening to the rule of law as that of his nomination or election to the ILC, because if he runs in for public office, let's see if he's gonna be able to. He will actually succeed.
Yes, I agree, and I think as you mentioned, both Attorney Te and you, Attorney Dino, we can contend with him, if he is elected, but it's another thing, if it's the whole humanity whom he will really pester, if he is elected there. Yasmin, last question for this part, and to Yasmin, is Mohan Perry facing any local legal actions, in Sri Lanka, or are there any other mechanisms that can hold him accountable for his for being remiss, in his obligations to human rights? Yasmin?
Thank you, Rose. The difficulty, of course, in Sri Lanka is that, under what was the good governance government, the one that was part of supporting a joint resolution in the Human Rights Council, there were a number of investigations that were conducted into what one would call emblematic human rights cases, and they also into questions of corruption. But of course, when you had this new government take over, the primary investigator had to flee the country. And he's sitting, having received asylum in Switzerland. And in fact, those units that were investigating these allegations were all basically dismantled, and the people who had in fact been doing the investigations discredited. But the president also set up a presidential commission. And basically, it was to exonerate people who had been implicated in allegations of either fraud or who had been indicted before the courts. And so effectively that commission's recommendations, which were accepted by Parliament this year, shockingly, has really led to an absence of being able to expect any kind of accountability at a domestic level. And so what you actually see are statements that are made by civil society, by international bodies, which are really kind of statements of censure. But in terms of legally holding people accountability for the dereliction of their duty, that is just not possible in Sri Lanka itself. And I think that when you look at, of course, at the question of, are you able to bring actions in other countries? And, this year in March, the High Commissioner for Human Rights appealed to member states to use what she called an arsenal of tools, which are in their possession: universal jurisdiction, visa vetting, sanctions, all of these robust tools. She appealed to member states to use them. And based on that report, the Council set up this international mechanism. But, it does raise this question when you consider that in their report in September, the ILC asked states for comments on the question of immunities in foreign jurisdictions. You can see how pivotal the role is that the person who's going to be appointed there is going to play. Because apart from the International Criminal Court, when you try to bring a case in other jurisdictions, what's the first thing you get hit with? Is immunity, which is really tied to office. And so, the ITJP, for instance, in 2019, we launched an action in the United States under the Torture Victims Protection Act on behalf of 11 torture victims. But the man who we had brought the case against won the elections. And so we were forced to drop the case because he now enjoyed immunity tied to his office. So these are very serious, progressive human rights issues which we have to monitor because they have a bearing on how they will affect our own ways of dealing with this question of accountability in so many different formats. So to a long story, to your question, it's just not possible. And, perhaps this is also, I think, something that we need to take up with the UN. And that is the question of states whom one would classify as not being compliant, but also how do you have a vetting process which allows the committee, even before it accepts nominations, to kind of weed out people that it thinks is unsuitable. I think these are the sort of process elements which we probably need to go to in the next part of the campaign.
Thank you for that very important recommendation, Yasmin. We have a lot to do, to advocate to the UN, including, of course, vetting of nominees and candidates. And we should also hold our states accountable if they will be nominating people who are not really qualified and who will really ruin the reputation and integrity of these very important institutions. May we just post, Nisa, the list of candidates for the Asia Pacific seats in the ILC. As we mentioned earlier, the election will happen tomorrow by secret ballot 11 a.m. New York time, with UN General Assembly members voting 8 from the Asia Pacific states. No, so what is at stake is 8 seats. No, but currently we have 11 candidates. If the candidate from what is that country? Uzbekistan have already withdrawn, so we have 10 candidates and we have 8 seats. And of course, we would like 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Mohan Paris not to be included in that state, in the 8 seats that will be elected to the ILC. So tomorrow, 11 a.m. New York time, 11 p.m. New York time, expect from iDefend, from Flag, and from Attorney Dino, we will be tweeting and we will be posting to all our social media accounts what will happen to the election. Okay, we will take a short intermission now, and if Attorney Te will be leaving us, it's okay. We understand you have another meeting, but we will be back with the short intermission. Thank you, Attorney Ted.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I have another call at 5:15.
Yeah,
Thank you
it's
very
okay.
much.
Okay, our video intermission. Jay, please. Thank you.
Pagkatapos nito, babalik lang ba tayo sa normal? Sa mabilis na takbo ng buhay, araw-araw ay sugal. Silang panalo, tayo ang talunan, sa araw-araw na pakikipagsapalaran. Yan ba ang babalikan pagkatapos nito? Yan ba ang babalikan pagkatapos nito? Pagkatapos nito, balik lang ba sa dating gawin? Sa marahas na takbo ng buhay, puno ng takot at pangamba, ligalig-ligang laking kaulayaw, mula umaga hanggang gabi. Yan ba ang haharapin pagkatapos nito? Yan ba ang haharapin pagkatapos nito? Pagkatapos nito, may bago tayong lakas. Sama-sama nating tahakin ang ating landas. Iwawasto ang liko-likong daan, isisigaw ang ating panawagan. Mas maayos na lipunan pagkatapos nito. Mas maayos na lipunan pagkatapos nito. Alam na natin ang dapat na gawin. Gising natin kinabukasan, pagbangon natin pagkatapos nito. Pagbangon natin pagkatapos nito. Babangon tayo pagkatapos nito. Babangon tayo pagkatapos nito.
Hello, good afternoon again, and thank you for watching us. We are discussing about the International Law Commission, discussing our objection against two, can we call them human rights violators, no? Objecting to their nomination to the ILC. And the ILC election will be held tomorrow, New York time, 11 a.m. and the United Nations General Assembly will be voting in secret, by secret ballot. But we hope we can give the news immediately after we've learned if Mohan Paris or Attorney 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗏 will be accepted. Of course, we want them not accepted to the ILC. For this particular section, we would just, of course, also like to discuss some of the human rights concerns of Sri Lanka and the Philippines, no? Because our objection actually boiled to these concerns in both countries. There are human rights violations, continuous human rights violations, even escalating violations affecting our civic space, vilifying, even killing our human rights defenders and activists. And this is the reason that these two persons, Attorney 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Mohan Paris, is actually justifying, no, the actions of their governments. And we would like to discuss about some of the major human rights issues in the Philippines and Sri Lanka. So, who would like to start? Attorney Dino, would you like to discuss some of your observations right now, no? In the continuing violations here in the Philippines, including, of course, the situation of Senator Laila de Lima, who has been imprisoned for more than 4 years already. Attorney Dino?
Miss Rose, I think Attorney Dino lost his connections.
Okay. Maybe if it's okay with Yasmin, we can start with her. Yasmin, would you be able to share some of the current situation in Sri Lanka after the war, no? And then the actions of the government, but what is existing right now in Sri Lanka?
Thank you, Rose, for your question. I think that, you know, in my earlier response, I talked about the fact that, you know, since this president was elected, he set up a number of mechanisms, basically, to indemnify or exonerate people who are implicated either in human rights violations or serious war crimes, and also, you know, in corruption. And in fact, what he then did was, you know, the recommendations of those commissions, he's kind of made available to Parliament, and they passed them. And so effectively, people have been let off the hook. Now, one of the things the ITJP has been doing, beyond looking at the war crimes issue, has been the ongoing question of torture and sexual violence in torture. And in fact, what we published a report in September this year on documentation we had done of around 15 people who had been tortured, many of them with, no apparent link to any kind of separatist or former terrorist movement, but they were in fact abducted by the army. They were unlawfully detained, and in fact, they were really brutally tortured. And in our report, we actually detail the kind of torture, but it really raised a question which I think at an international level we have to explore. And this was something that, Manfred Novak, when he was the special rapporteur on torture, talked about. How do you handle states where torture has become endemic and where it has become part of the structural impunity in a country? Should they be permitted to participate in UN bodies, or should they be excluded? And I think that poses a new challenge for many of us who are in countries trying to promote this question of accountability. In the case of Sri Lanka, of course, the government has always maintained the fiction that they are fighting an asymmetrical conflict. And so they constantly, even though they defeated the Tamil Tigers, they constantly raise the narrative of the LTTE becoming regrouping. And that then is an excuse for them to maintain the kind of, preventive terrorism law on their statute books, despite going back several years where they've undertaken to make changes to bring it in line with international norms and standards. And so one of the things we've said to the international community, you have to be careful not only to look at the so-called legal system, which in fact many rapporteurs have commented on, because what you have in the country are two systems. There's a black system where people just disappear, they unlawfully detained, they tortured, they suffer terrible sexual violence. And then, of course, their families have to pay bribes to the security forces to get them out of the country. And of course, this implicates also corrupt officials at the borders, at the airport, who are also involved in taking money to allow people to escape. But that, of course, operates side by side with the legal system. So, under the PTA, people are detained. And increasingly, a law that is supposed to be in line with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the domesticated version in Sri Lanka is being used to unlawfully, detain, arrest and detain people. And after the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, which involved, according to the government, Muslims, you've had the roundup of a number of Muslims, including lawyers who have been held incommunicado for a very long period of time. And then, of course, you've had a lot of protests in the country, protests against the system, protests on the failure to deal with those who have been disappeared at the end of the war. And you've had a number of protesters taken in. And then, of course, when you couple that with the fact that the government is ideologically promoting what I would call an ethno-nationalist, Sinhala Buddhist rhetoric in the country, which basically ignores the rights of minorities, then you can see that this is a real recipe for disaster. And that, of course, is also creating a fertile climate for, ethnic and hate speech issues, which are becoming a problem in the country. And more recently, the president announced another presidential commission, which is going to be led by a nationalist Buddhist religious leader, and people just see this as a huge problem in the country and one which will impact on minorities. So all in all, you've got a president who's arrogated an enormous amount of power to himself. This year, we also published an infographic. When you look at all of the positions in government, his brother is the prime minister, his son holds a cabinet post, his nephew holds, and basically they control all of the tentacles in Sri Lanka of both government and governance. And of course, they sit in many different institutions, and their collaboration means that effectively you have a state which we have called 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗀𝗃 Incorporated. And it's really, really very difficult to hold them accountable. And I think that's a challenge that we are sitting with.
It's quite amazing, no? That there are so many similarities between Sri Lanka and the Philippines, although we really have different culture. No, but what you were saying, the lack of accountability, the corruption, the discrimination against minorities, and the continuing civil and political rights violations, no? Like torture and enforced disappearance. We all have them now here in the Philippines. And it has been really quite a struggle for us, no? And even our Sri Lankan colleagues. I remember, I think that was around 2011 or 2012, we have two human rights defenders from Sri Lanka, a couple, no, who came here for temporary, I do not, how do you say that, temporary shelter, no?
Yeah.
Because they are being surveilled, and there were attempts to arrest this couple, and they came to us here in the Philippines, and they were amazing people, and I really miss them because I know they're again back in Sri Lanka and still helping out with our human rights struggle.
Yeah, I was going to say that, in fact, when you look at the figures for enforced disappearances, Sri Lanka, I think, is around second on the list. And these disappearances go back many years to different periods of conflict. Now, when you look at the report of the High Commission in 2015 around, the serious international crimes that took place, it's very clear that there are many individuals, and one of them, who is the current commander of the army, his division was said to be responsible for many of the executions and enforced disappearances that took place. But despite that, the country made him the army commander. And that made, the ITJP then prepared a number of submissions to different sanctions bodies. And in fact, in the United States, under the human rights designation, he and his family were designated, and he's unable to travel. And, this year we also did a similar submission to the United Kingdom's global Magnitsky, sanctions regime. And that has really raised for us the question of, when you cannot get criminal accountability, when it's really difficult to bring universal jurisdiction cases, what other methods should you use? And so, in fact, the Sri Lanka, peacekeeping is another area that we looked at. And we discovered that, when the Sri Lankans were peacekeepers in Haiti, they were also alleged to have been implicated in sexual exploitation and abuse. And for that, they were repatriated back to the country under the expectation that the country itself would, honor its own status of forces agreement and ensure accountability. And of course, that didn't happen. And given the fact that a number of the victims are children, you can imagine how desperate that is for Haiti and the children who were left behind. And so what we have done is we've also made submissions to the peacekeeping, DPKO at the time. And at one point, we got the peacekeeping forces suspended, only to be allowed in really serious situations. But one has to think a little bit outside of the box on how you can name and shame, but also how you can prevent countries from occupying positions of stature, which are accorded to them almost as a matter of honor. And I think that's what we together have to pursue. And it's amazing. I mean, the similarities between the Philippines, it really raises these questions which we are beginning to reflect on when we talk about transitional justice. And that is, what is the link between prevention and conflict transformation? And how do you deal with, in fact, determining many of the risk factors, which are governance questions, which are questions of economic governance and access, and which are also social, political, and legal. And so when you talk about enjoying or reclaiming your full rights as a citizen, I think it raises how we need to bring into play all of these issues. So I see a lot of room for collaboration going beyond this campaign around these two individuals.
Yes, and really, our international solidarity really plays a role, no, in strengthening all our advocacies. But it is very regrettable, no, to hear that even peacekeepers are doing their, oh my God, bastardly acts in another state, which is, I think, really is unforgivable. We have not heard of any incident like that of peacekeepers from the Philippines. I think they're doing their job, good job, at least in other states. No? But it's another issue, what we are experiencing right now, the continuing violation. And maybe Jay from iDefend can give some, I would not say an overview, no? But what are the main issues we now have, especially in the light of election next year? No? Is there any hope for the Philippines for a new administration that will really uphold and promote human rights? Jay?
I think the operative word really is we're being hopeful. We're being hopeful that the next administration, the next government will be someone or a group of politicians who will respect and fulfill the human rights of the people. Right now, we will be facing an election who have a son of the former dictator Marcos, who will be running for the highest position for the country, and the daughter of the current tyrant leader, the daughter of the President Duterte, who is expected to run for either the presidency or the vice presidency, to either continue the whole tyrannical type of government, or to prevent the government to be held accountable, or both. So that's what we are going to face by next year, May of 2022, in the coming 2022 national elections. I think the importance of these international mechanisms is really for human rights defenders to come in together, to pull together and be able to be united in fighting and struggling, continue struggling for the rights of every people, not just here in the Philippines, but in every part of the world. I think the mere nomination of Attorney Harry Roque is a mockery to the justice system. It is an attack to the hopes of many victims who are continuously being mocked, vilified by this government.
Thank you, Jay. Just to inform our audience, we actually lost Attorney Dino De Leon. No, he's having a hard time getting back. I think not good connection from where he is right now. But we are very grateful to Attorney Te and Attorney Dino, who had joined us, no, in this discussion. Maybe just for some last comments, no? We know that both our countries, Sri Lanka and the Philippines, are really struggling, no, in accountability concerns. We do not have that domestically, so we're actually resorting to international mechanisms, and of course, we do not want the ILC to compromise, no, with people like 𝗏𝗏 and Paris putting their thoughts in that very important standard setting of international human rights and humanitarian, and as Yasmin mentioned earlier, including climate concerns, no, will be also discussed by the ILC. But domestic accountability is really very difficult in Sri Lanka and in the Philippines. May I just ask you, perhaps, is there any other strategy or mechanisms that we can do to push back, no, against violations of human rights, including, of course, the shrinking civic space, both in Sri Lanka and in the Philippines? What more can we do as human rights defenders, as activists, and as a solidarity network? Yasmin, would you want to start?
I think
You're on
Yasmin
mute.
is on mute.
Sorry.
Sorry, Peter. You know, I think what we're seeing in the world is growing impunity across so many countries, including in my own South Africa, by the way. You know, the inability of even democratic states to hold those who should be held accountable. And I think that's one problem. So domestically, we find ourselves then litigating. And in many countries, you can't litigate because that also exposes you to being abducted and detained, as in Sri Lanka. And then, of course, at an international level, increasingly we are seeing in UN bodies the election of states who themselves violate human rights. And that is also creating a polarized environment. You know, of course, many people speak about the reform of the UN. And, you know, whenever you raise an issue, sometimes your own state will say, but they're double standards. But I think that in the Human Rights Council, what I'm beginning to notice is that when we shifted from the UN Human Rights Committee to the Human Rights Council, it was done on the basis that the Human Rights Council should represent the interests of victims, that it would be their voices that would prevail. But when you begin to look at what has been happening in the last few years, you see a number of states grouped together, and they raise the question of sovereignty. And often when you look at country-specific resolutions, or one which are meant to address the question of shrinking civil space or human rights defenders, then these countries will block those resolutions. And so that polarization, I think, is something we need to begin to look at. And it really is raising this question of how we address what I would call structural impunity, but also the question of solidarity among civil society in different countries. Because I kind of see that the only way we are going to overcome these problems, and in fact, it's almost the beginnings of a new struggle for human rights in the world. We can only do it if we do it together. But that also means, that the traditional tools that we've used, we have to think about how do we create, vetting programs at a whole host of levels. How do we create dossiers on people which we share with member states and with different country representatives? Because it's one thing to be elected to the ILC, but it's a very different thing for you to be accepted by your colleagues. And so if we can make it uncomfortable for you to be respected by your colleague, then that's another way we can deal with you. So much so that you either resign or your colleagues ask you to step down. And so in my view, that's like, that's the power we as civil society have. Dossiers, information, short notes, but making it really difficult for these people to occupy spaces and seats at the table. But it requires solidarity. And I think that's something we have to rebuild amongst, civil society and human rights communities across the world if we're going to make a difference.
Thank you, Yasmin. And actually, we are waiting for the launch of the right to protest. I didn't know if you've heard of that. There is a beginning, a movement of right to protest, because there's so many things to protest right now, as you mentioned earlier. No, these groupings of states, no, against human rights, the intentional distortion of human rights concepts and principles, which we think it is really very important in our solidarity, that we claim the genuine concepts of human rights, and that is promoting universality, primarily, but of all human rights. Anyway, Jay, would you want to add anything?
I very much agree to what Yasmin said. I think it's really time to strengthen more our solidarity efforts with fellow human rights defenders. If one cannot is being suppressed with their stance and their calls, another should stand for and with them. And in terms of the international mechanisms, I think the ILC, the United Nations, can really expect more from the civil society organizations, more from the groups that protested the nominations of these two people, especially if they get elected. They would really hear from us more, even more, and we will continue to have our voices be heard so that these groups, these bodies, will be able to really uphold their true mandate of recognizing, fulfilling, and respecting human rights causes.
Thank you, Jay. And we actually had a very good discussion. And we hope we can have some more discussions like this, like with Sri Lanka, with the issues of South Africa, also very interesting. No, but to our very particular campaign rejecting these two persons, Mohan Peri and 𝗏𝗏𝗏, to the ILC. Not to be voted tomorrow by the UNGA, we would like to ask, of course, Yasmin for her last words and last calls for this campaign.
Thank you. And I think that we need, through signature campaigns, to make our voices heard. We have a few more hours to convince member states of the rightness of our campaigns, and we need to use the time to make sure that we get as many of them to understand the nature and the character of the people we are dealing with. So thank you very much, Rose. This is incredible, the discussion.
Thank you. Jay, for your last words and calls.
For iDefend, I will just read iDefend's statement for today. Our country's experience with justice and accountability is mostly similar with Sri Lanka. We've had decades of gross neglect and human rights violations that have never been held accountable. This means we have generations that have never seen what accountability actually looks like for, let's say, the police killings and military atrocities. In the Philippines, the deep-seated impunity at the national and local levels have permitted into the smallest administrative units or barangays, such that authorities abusing their power are considered normal. This government has given a bionic push towards institutionalizing impunity at the highest levels, with the president himself telling soldiers not to worry if they rape up to 3 rebels. The impact to our society has been devastating. As seen in our response to the global pandemic, we are one of the worst performers in the world. we have one of the most repressive anti-COVID measures. Thus, we seek to enforce accountability in every space we are able. If we teach our children to take responsibility for their actions, but they see authorities get away with their crimes, our future is doomed. And that's scarier for us than the virus. Our 𝗟𝗃 petition is a small contribution towards seeking accountability for human rights atrocities against our people. We will continue to engage where the space is available and to push back against repression and to hold to account all perpetrators of human rights violation. And we join Sri Lanka in their campaign against 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗏𝗏's nomination. We look forward to an 𝗟𝗃 free from any human rights violators. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to all our audience, watchers, all our friends, and of course, Attorney Ted Te, Attorney Dino De Leon, and a very new friend, which we hope we will be dear friend in the future with continuous collaboration. Yasmin Suker, thank you very much, and give our regards to colleagues in South Africa and Sri Lanka, and we hope that we will win tomorrow. No Mohan Paris and no 𝗏𝗏𝗷𝗏𝗃 in 𝗟𝗃. Thank you very much, our dear friends. Please join us in monitoring the election tomorrow, 11 a.m. in New York. I don't know what time is it in Sri Lanka or in South Africa, but in the Philippines it will be 11 p.m. Philippine time tomorrow. So
Also,
thank you
Ms.
very
Rose, I'd like to add, they can actually, the people can watch I think they can watch the session. They just need to go to the media.un.org website.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Jay, for that reminder. And as human rights defender, as mentioned by Yasmin and Jay, we can do more together in international solidarity, helping each other in our domestic accountability, but more so, if we cannot have accountability in our own country, there is still the international community, the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, all this Magnitsky Act, in Europe, in UK, and in the US. We have to do that. We have to maximize that, and we have to preserve the integrity of the 𝗟𝗃, to have people with credibility, to have people with who are really experts on international human rights and humanitarian law, and who will promote and respect our human rights. Thank you, everyone, and good night. Goodbye. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, guys.
191 people have lost their lives.
COVID-19 is spreading.
Department of Health reported 9 new confirmed cases. Patients 25.
Measures na pinapatupad ngayon gaya ng social distancing.
Na wala pa silang tatanggap na ayuda mula sa pamahalaan bilang pagsunod sa isinasaad sa enhanced community.
Ng mga inaasikasong COVID-19 patients, maraming doktor ang hindi na po nakakauwi.
To take urgent and aggressive action.
Lumabas tayo.
Lumabas tayo sa makitid na pananaw, papunta sa malawak na pag-unawa sa isa't isa, lalo para sa mga taong naisasantabi at kailangan pakinggan.
Lumabas tayo mula sa mga kanya-kanyang pag-aalala, lampas sa sari-sariling pangamba, dahil ang kailangang harapin ay sinusubok tayong magkakasama.
Lumabas tayo mula sa pananahimik. Dahil ngayong ang buhay natin ang nakataya, ay hindi dapat pipi at nakapikit. Napapastulin nila tungong bangin.
Lumabas tayo mula sa dilim ng panlilinlang at pandilito. Malinaw sa atin kung ano ang gusto nating masalubong, sa paglabas natin ngayon papuntang bukas.
Kabuhayan na sasapat,
Kain na busog,
tahanan nakakanlong, malayang umalam, kumilos, makialam.
Unahin ang kapakanan ng mamamayan, kilalanin ang karapatan.
Lalabas tayo sa kabanatang ito sa buhay natin. Baon ng katotohanang may mas malalaki pa tayong mapagwawagian.
Na hindi na tayo papayag maipasok muli sa ganitong hirap na kalagayan dahil matutut tayong lumaban sa iba pang mga sakit ng lipunan.
Lumabas tayo. Lumaban tayo.